Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Evan Knoll. I'm the Director of Marketing at DrayNow. Welcome to our webinar, Setting a Precedent in Unprecedented Times, the New Freight Climate, led by our very own Tom Ryan, who heads up business development at DrayNow. This webinar is going to really dig into how COVID-19 impacts both freight and intermodal and kind of looks at some historical precedents for how different historical events have impacted freight and how it moves. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask them in the Q&A section, and we should be getting to them at the end. Again, thank you for joining, and I'm going to hand it over to Tom.
All right, well, thank you, Evan. Good afternoon and welcome to our DrayNow webinar. As Evan said, setting a precedent in unprecedented times, the new freight climate. If we're being introduced for the first time, I'm Tom Ryan, and as Evan said, the Vice President of Business Development for DrayNow. I'll give you a little bit of a background on myself. I've worked with the founders of DrayNow since our formation 3 years ago. It's hard to believe that that much time has passed so quickly, but during my career, I had a number of sales and operating positions in LTL, container shipping, intermodal rail, intermodal drayage, and logistics. So hopefully everyone is joining us today from the comfort of their home, or at least a safe workplace, and we certainly apologize if this is your umpteenth Zoom call of the day. We get it, we know how it feels, but so we really appreciate you taking the time today to talk about how COVID-19 affects the future, or how can we predict the future now. So we certainly see words like uncharted, unprecedented, and uncertain floating around the COVID-19 crisis. We just don't know what's going to happen moving forward. It's a crazy time, and really looking back, the only major event in the last 100 years to compare to this crisis would have been the influenza pandemic during 1918 to 1919, purely in terms of a similar type situation and similar magnitude. In my 3 years, the DrayNow team is really great to work with. They are a very, very curious bunch of people. And we've had many discussions over the last 3 years, and for certain the past few weeks, about how we should think about the future personally and professionally. And this got us thinking about how this crisis will reshape the intermodal industry and the freight transportation network in general. Well, we all know that we really can't predict the future. No one can. We don't know how COVID-19 will impact freight and specifically intermodal. But as we did some brainstorming, we thought to look back at some recent similar type events in history might give us some insight on what to expect. Well, in this century, we've had the SARS outbreak in early 2000 and the swine flu in 2009. But in the case of SARS, the ports, if you remember, were open in Asia, and basically where the outbreak had started, they just never closed. And the swine flu coincided directly with the recession, so it's hard to tell what effect, if any, that had. And going back even further to the 1919 influenza pandemic, how could we even compare that to now? The world was much more fragmented. Our economies were still pretty regional and certainly disconnected from one another. It was a different world with a different population and a very, very different transportation infrastructure. So this begs the question, with this once-in-a-century event we're currently living through, what precedent, if any, are we able to look to for predicting the future of freight? Well, clearly, the answers to this question can be found, in our opinion, in a mix of data, historical events, and industry knowledge. So we decided to take a look back at some major events and how they impacted our industry and see what we can discover that would give us an indication of just what we might expect. So from an energy crisis to major weather events that crippled our highways and railroads for prolonged periods of time, to labor disruptions, to world-altering events like 9/11, these events disrupted the way in which freight transportation operated, and in many cases paved the way for substantial change that we're still seeing today. So let's take a closer look. Well, we kind of thought about how to kickstart this look back and figured maybe the best way to structure this would be in chronological order. So we're going to start in the 1970s. And I'm going to make an assumption that the majority of the audience today may not have been around during those times. But for those of us that were, we certainly remember it well. There wasn't just one, but two oil crises that took place in the 70s, 1973 and 1979. And both had major impact on us personally, and certainly the impact of the movement of goods to our markets. It affected the daily lives of many of us, and especially the truck drivers. As much as I personally would enjoy it, I'm not going to get into the geopolitics of the two events. But essentially, OPEC, we're all familiar with that, put an oil embargo on many countries, including our own, the US, which caused a supply shock, to say the least, and high prices for oil, which in turn caused high fuel prices. So what we witnessed was high demand leading to high prices as a result of this manufactured oil supply event. It's hard to comprehend that we were rationing gas and fuel and that long lines of cars and trucks were commonplace. So how did the 73 crisis affect the freight industry? Well, at the time, we were a government-regulated industry back then, and with fuel prices rising rapidly and the availability of fuel scarce, owner-operators were losing money by the mile, while hauling approximately 70% of the country's freight. So this led to protests and even riots by the truck drivers and the public. All around the country, small protests were causing complete freight stoppages and congestions on the roads. But probably more importantly, what long-standing changes stemmed from these actions? Well, the oil crisis was really the straw that broke the camel's back for truck drivers, leading, as I said, to strikes, slowdowns, and even the formation of OIDA, the Owner Operators Independent Driver Association, an advocacy group for independent truckers. And truckers all across the country protested and slowed down the movement of freight, which I think is going to probably sound very familiar to us. During both these crises, there were a lot of regulations on the trucking industry from the Interstate Commerce Commission. And again, for those that don't recognize that name, it was the government agency that regulated trucking at the time. The ICC controlled entry into the field, such as carriers having to buy or petition the ICC under an old term known as public convenience and necessity to gain the rights to access routes and entry into certain states or geographic areas. Believe it or not, it even assigned carriers certain designations to haul certain types of cargo, and in some cases, specific highway routes that truckers could run over, and also controlled pricing, something that obviously very familiar to us today. During this time period, the ICC allocated fuel to truck stops for truckers and allowed carriers to charge 6% fuel surcharge on their trips, which was only a temporary fix to the issue. Hard to imagine what that was like compared to the world we live in today. These regulations, combined with skyrocketing fuel prices, became unsustainable. By the time the '79 crisis came around, the same concerns were abound throughout the industry. So the ICC set fuel prices as a more permanent fix. And then the Motor Carrier Act of 1980 was ushered in a short time later, which really set the precedent for the deregulated trucking industry we see today. So from a fuel crisis and a trucker strike in 1973, we ended up with a deregulated industry that created a more efficient and competitive carrier market, which in turn led to more competitive prices on freight and goods. Then, the most significant event since World War II took place in our country, 9/11. So let's take a look at an event that impacted many aspects of our lives, but specifically, I'd like to look at the movement of freight itself, not just the truckers. Pre-9/11, transportation security was not something that was really ingrained in our society. A person could walk right up to the gate at an airport, pick up or drop off a friend, and not too many years prior, believe it or not, we could even smoke on the plane. Now security is extensive, and entire government departments like the TSA, DHS, CBP, and others have been created to address the need for protecting the country. As unfortunate as it is, it takes an event like 9/11 to identify the problems that lie within an industry. Prior to 9/11, we really didn't have a good control of what was arriving at our ports and borders. There was no telling what might show up. We had loose security at the thousands of access points across the country. In our post-9/11 world, there have been many changes that have tightened up our ports of entry so that we have a higher degree of certainty of what's coming in. So you might be wondering, besides providing a much greater level of needed security around our freight movements, especially international transport, so all these changes have a positive impact on our industry. There certainly was a ton of new regulations put in place that drove transportation costs up and slowed down the flow of freight. While these security regulations increased freight costs, in the end, the improved visibility and the eventual increased efficiency ushered in substantial change for our industry. Increased visibility in the supply chain led to a greater amount of data on the freight movements and led us into the era of supply chain optimization. Technologies were developed and implemented to provide the utmost visibility on all freight moves on the ground and enhanced measures like TWIC registration for people working at the ports or RFID tags on containers made freight transport safer and more visible. But pre-9/11, with less security and less visibility, there was more room for disruption of the supply chain if something did fall through the cracks. The lower cost to ship, deliver, and get to market when shipments were delayed or lost in the process also cost us heavily. But with more visibility in the supply chain, the collaboration of industry stakeholders to share information and data, and the increased security, the industry as a whole became more efficient. So, another example of the disruptions in our supply chain really related to the ports. So what happens when port strikes cause freight to come to a screeching halt? Well, major disruptions in the supply chain begin to affect business and consumers, causing the economy to lose billions of dollars along the way. There are three major stoppages to look at. The 2002 West Coast lockout, where ports were completely shut down for many days, along with those in 2012 and 2015. Due to port strikes, volumes literally nosedive. The economy ends up losing billions of dollars due to severe delays in loading and unloading ships, trucks, and trains, and therefore cost of goods delivered increases. We hear of strikes all the time, whether they involve teachers or nurses or retail workers. But when they involve the gatekeepers of the goods and services that we import, this is really when things get serious. And in 2012, it was estimated that the economic impact was around $1 billion per day in losses. So as cargo volumes are estimated to have decreased about 20% due to COVID-19, many sources have compared the port strikes to today's crisis in terms of sheer volume decrease. In 2015, the California ports on strikes are about a 27% decrease in cargo volume. The strikes are always resolved due to catastrophic effects that they have on our economy, and the freight market usually makes a V-shaped recovery and things that end up back to normal in no time. It's hard to tell, depending on how long our current situation lasts, if that will be the same, but the hope is that we bounce back with that same relatively quick recovery. And finally, I wanted to wrap up a couple things with what is probably our most cyclical issue year in and year out, that's both predictable and unpredictable at the same time. And I'm talking about severe weather. We all know it could come. We never know exactly when or just how bad it could get. And probably the most substantive and direct data you're going to see from any of these scenarios comes from the weather incidents, which for a period of time just crippled the industry entirely. So everything that could possibly happen does happen with severe weather. Severe weather could mean anything from thunderstorms to tornadoes, but I'm talking about the ones that last long and have long-lasting impacts on the freight and the economy. And those two are the grueling winter weather season and hurricanes. On the front lines with winter weather, you have really natural slowdowns and build up the freight at the ports and the rail yards, broken down trucks, train derailments, chassis shortages due to high volumes of containers unable to move over the road or on the rails. And on the macro level, we get higher spot rates for the freight that is moving, and since capacity is not readily available. One such example, I think maybe everybody can relate to, is the 2014 polar vortex. An entire season of frigid temperatures and bad storms brought the industry to its knees. Train service and this intermodal were specifically affected because no matter what measures you take to free up the trains, no matter how many times you throw out those rails, it's only a temporary fix until the next freeze. And once things clear up, it's the domino effect, right? It takes weeks and sometimes months to rebalance the trains, the yards, the chassis pools, and get the containers turned and back into the system. Just to keep things moving, a lot of volume was starting to move to over the road. And then even in the 2019 vortex, which was obviously much shorter, the industry saw spot rates shoot up. You can even see in DrayNow's chart on the right there that the rates in Chicago distinctly increased during that week or so in 2019. With service issues on the rails and truckloads primarily shifting to over the road, you have an overall freight slowdown because the weather doesn't discriminate against one mode in favor of the other. Both are treacherous. Furthermore, you're oversaturating an over-the-road market that doesn't have enough capacity. And with hurricanes, a particularly uncertain and shaky season can cause major capacity problems, whether it's in trucks or rails not being available, or carriers finding new opportunities in disaster relief if the hurricane is major enough. Even though these weather situations on the surface are complete opposite of the situation we're in now, which is one of flush capacity and declining demand with lower rates, both situations greatly affect the industry for an uncertain period of time and is their biggest similarity. So, what can we predict? Well, this leads us to some thoughts at what we might expect. Putting everything that we just touched upon into perspective, these next few months or longer, we'll see disruptions and swings in volume and supply as the system readjusts itself. And the phased-in federal guidelines approach is dependent on individual states' plans. Hopefully not a reoccurrence in the pandemic and in consumer confidence, which is still the great unknown. This is not going to be a smooth ride and definitely one that we've never experienced before. So, working with the bunch of great people at DrayNow, we came up with a few predictions. And I'd like to take a few minutes and run you through those predictions. And our prediction number one is around container and chassis shortages. Since lockdowns are either forcing warehouses to shut down or the ones that are open, building up excess inventory that's really not getting distributed, containers aren't getting unloaded instead of being really stored for the foreseeable future. So what does this mean for chassis and container availability? Well, they're not moving. So it's going to disrupt the usual flow of freight over the rails. You know, some head haul lanes, such as the heavy LA to Chicago lane, has actually reversed itself. And what does that mean for rail car, container, and chassis positioning? And when you're talking about container networks and their support, you have to talk global networks that will be out of balance, which is a major concern in the demand-supply relationship worldwide. Our second prediction is really around more detention and longer dwell times. And for the freight that is available, there's certainly going to be disruptions in service. With less labor on hand at warehouses and more precautionary measures being taken, we're already seeing longer loading and unloading times and higher detention costs across the industry. So how this will look in the future is really dependent on how long the lockdown restrictions will last. But for now, this is the present that we are dealing with today. Our third prediction is really around the trucker advocacy and protests. Just as the 1970s oil crisis brought in higher levels of trucker advocacy, we can expect the same now in the time of COVID-19. You know, we're already seeing protests across the country in Texas, Arizona, California, and the industry has always put a great deal of pressure, as we all know, on the truck. So now that it's being combined with the fact that the drivers are risking exposure to COVID-19, potentially, quite honestly, endangering their lives, all the while dealing with plummeting rates, I believe that we'll see truckers and drivers start to push back more on the industry, especially as they continue to be deemed the essential workers, which they are. Prediction number four, temporary shift to over the road. Zeroing in on our intermodal piece, as fuel prices keep decreasing to the obviously lower demand, intermodal could see even sharper decreases in volume as the shippers eye up those low prices, abundant capacity, really truly expedited service, and shifts towards the usually more expensive over-the-road option. It was just announced last week that rail volumes are already down almost 11% from last year. So we're already starting to see the effects firsthand. Number five, intermodal will start back. Well, the question is when? And we feel it's going to be a climb back starting in sometime in Q4. We predict that intermodal volumes will have a bounce, but it's going to be sometime in Q4. That time of year and the initial boost, once economies start to fully reopen, really should lead to some level of uptick. The strength of that uptick will be dependent on whether the economy shows a U, a V, an L, or a W-shaped recovery. Who knows? We do expect there will be areas of capacity shortages, over the road and in drayage in the midst of all of this, which will depend on the consumer spending, the types of freight demand, the resurgence of the virus, state reopenings, the rail networks and support businesses rebalanced, and our industry providing really a competitive service and price to meet the over-the-road product. No matter what, there's a delicate balance of many factors and influence that will drive the intermodal recovery. And number 6, we strongly believe that technology is going to become a necessity. Across the world, workers have been making new adjustments to work from home. At DrayNow, we've found that transition to be very smooth. We've even started a company-wide online happy hour, obviously Fridays after 6 o'clock, workout sessions, yoga, and what we call a mindfulness session to keep us on the cutting edge, to keep us all connected as we continue to provide the service our customers have come to expect. So the world is changing. Technology will be critical in every aspect, not just in how we communicate internally amongst ourselves, but with our customers and partners in the intermodal supply chain. Increased collaboration amongst the stakeholders, real-time visibility of the first and final mile in intermodal trucking, combined with real-time factual data, providing actionable decision-making, is what will drive out the inefficiencies and provide our customers a more seamless intermodal experience to meet the changing world of freight transportation. So, what do you predict? Well, based on some of the comparisons we've made previously, it's very difficult and probably a little foolish to make any assertions on what to expect in the near term. However, I am personally certain of one major change that we will witness. If we think that this experience that we're going through now will not change how we think and act, I think we're very mistaken. Do we think we haven't noticed, or I personally, how clear and clean our cities and waters have become in such a short period of time? And what will that effect that have on us personally and in business? And what about our business practices? I mean, technology has certainly kept us moving freight and communicating with our customers and carriers, even as we work remotely. So a couple of things I wanted to point out that during my career, I believe there's been 3 major changes that have really shaped the freight transportation business. Change number 1 was really in moving cargo in break bulk, in loose pieces, to the world of containerization that occurred in the late 1950s through the vision of Malcolm McLean. The second really was, we talked about earlier, it was deregulation of the truck and rail industry in 1980. The third was the advent of the double stack car in 1984 by the UP. But there is a fourth, and that fourth is going to be technology. This pandemic will drive that conversion to technology, data-driven decisions, and collaboration amongst the stakeholders in intermodal much faster than the other 3, in my opinion. As I mentioned in our last prediction, number 6, technology will be more important than ever. It will be a necessity. This will only accelerate the digitization of our industry. Headcounts, quite honestly, will probably not likely go back to the former levels after this. And customers are certainly going to demand more and more visibility to fine-tune their networks. Technology is coming even faster now for the intermodal and for the freight business. When the economy recovers, so does freight. Right now, things are looking shaky, but since the downturn can be blamed on factors within our control, like the measures we're taking to prevent the spread of COVID-19, as opposed to a years in making financial collapse that we saw back in 08 and 09, we can only hope that this recovery will have a more U-shaped recovery, with things getting quickly back to business when this is all over. And when the country is back in business, so are we. Of course, right now is an uncertain time, with things changing every single day, but I certainly hope, and we hope, that today's presentation in these last 20 or 30 minutes at least put some type of perspective in place for you. Thank you very much. And if there's any questions, I think.
Yeah, we got a few, Tom. This first one, here, I'll read it out to you. Considering historical events, is it safe to say that they were essentially regional and didn't necessarily shut down the entire country for an extended period of time? Being over 6 weeks into stay-at-home orders in most of the country and losing one seasonal surge, how can the economy, especially intermodal, come back with unemployment figures where they are currently?
So there seems to be a couple of questions in that one question, Evan.
Yeah, I think so.
Right. So I think the first part, if I heard you correctly, was really about how did these events that we described earlier affect the, was it more on a regional or a nationwide basis?
Correct,
Correct?
yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
Well, certainly the polar vortex of 15 certainly shut the nation down because it shut the rail system down. And as everybody knows, so as Chicago goes, so goes the rail industry. And the Midwest was particularly hit for 3 or 4 month period. So that is the hub of domestic and international commerce in this country, and that affected the entire nation. And so with port strikes, right? The ports in Southern Cal, feed the network, the regional networks in our country through the rail system. So I would say that the issues that we talked about certainly had major effects across the nation. We're too interconnected, whether that be by rail or highway, or by DCs and warehousing, for just one or major events to only affect one specific region. The second part of the question, you just highlight that for me real quick?
Yeah, being over 6 weeks into stay-at-home orders in most of the country and losing one seasonal surge, how can the economy, especially intermodal, come back with unemployment figures where they are currently?
Well, I don't think we are. I think it's going to. There's obviously a lot of factors that are dependent upon that uptick. We've talked about a number of things, obviously, and when, and nobody's got a specific when it's going to happen. But I do think with all the things that we talked about, states different openings, maybe, hopefully not the reoccurrence, the out of balance of networks. That takes time, right? So I think from an intermodal perspective, the way I see it happening, as the retail, we're a retail-driven market, as retail starts to come back, I think you're going to see a lot more over-the-road demand than intermodal. Those companies are going to want to get that freight off the West Coast warehouses and onto their shelves quickly. And then it depends upon how they're resupplied, depending on the consumer reaction to that. So I think a couple other things are going to occur, and that is, we're going to lose capacity. With insurance costs, and even though fuel is way down, insurance costs are very expensive right now for independent truckers and for companies. And I think you're going to see a flush out of capacity. So how that balance works, is really another unknown. But I think we're going to see initially, a real resurgence on as much over the road. And if the consumer reacts to, the buying of those products, then I think there'll be another surge over the road. And then I think you're going to see a shortage of over the road capacity, and then more starting to move to intermodal. I think sometime in Q4, and certainly, next year, I think things start to get back to normal, and intermodal will start that slow climb that we talked about earlier.
Great, thanks, Tom. So it looks like we're just at 2:30. So thank you everyone for tuning in today. Please follow along with DrayNow on our blog, LinkedIn, and Twitter for more great content from Tom Ryan and others on the DrayNow team. And we will be sending this recording out in case you want to share it or watch again. Again, thank you and have a good day.
All right, thank you.